9 college students went on a trip through the snowy mountains in Russia. These 9 adventurers were super excited about the trip, and one day, as night was falling, they set up their tent on the side of a mountain slope. But after night fell, they faced something terrifying that they had never experienced before. This terrifying event, or thing they encountered, would turn into one of the most famous and mysterious cases in history. This incident would come to be known as the Dyatlov Pass case. And maybe you've heard about it before, since a lot of people have covered it before me. But it's one of the most mysterious cases out there, and I knew I'd make a video about it sooner or later. So, if you've already heard about it, I hope to present it to you in a different way, and that you enjoy it. Peace be upon you. This is Shamsuddin. The Dyatlov Pass case is a very old case, dating back to 1959, which means it happened 65 years ago. The location was in Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time. What happened was that a group of 10 adventurers decided to go on a trip to one of the mountain ranges. These 10 people were 8 guys and 2 girls, and most of them were college students, and they all studied at the same university. They were between 20 and 23 years old, and some had just recently graduated. Only one of them was 30 years old, and he wasn't a student or a recent graduate. These 10 weren't just newbie adventurers, and this wasn't their first trip. They were experienced adventurers with a lot of expertise. The mountain area they decided to visit is called the Ural Mountains, located in Siberia. Siberia is known for being one of the coldest regions in Russia, and it's a super tough and harsh place. So, what made these adventurers target such a difficult mountain region? Well, the reason was that back then, in the Soviet Union, there was an organization or union for trips and adventurers, and there were 3 levels of trips: Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3. All of these 10 adventurers were at Level 2, and their ambition was to reach Level 3. But they couldn't reach that level unless they completed a trip of the hardest type. The adventurers' goal from the trip was to reach Level 3, and the trip was sponsored by their university, which funded them. They were all members of the university's sports club. The leader of the trip was a 23-year-old guy named Igor Dyatlov, and he was the most experienced among them. So Dyatlov and his friends set out on this trip in January 1959. Of course, they lived in a city far from the mountains where they planned their adventure. To get to the mountains, they first took a train, and after arriving in Siberia, they took a bus, then a truck to take them to the start of the mountain area. At the mountains, they rode horse-drawn sleds and then continued their adventure on foot. Of course, all the photos you're seeing are real pictures taken by the adventurers themselves. They had cameras to capture the photos, and they kept diaries to document the events they went through, meaning they were recording everything about their trip. This was a key part of the journey since they were members of the organization and wanted to reach Level 3. From the start of the trip, everyone was excited, but one of them, named Yuri Yudin, started feeling intense back pain after the first 2 days. When he realized he couldn't continue the trip, he decided to head back, leaving his friends and his dream of reaching Level 3 behind. Of course, at that moment, he felt sad and regretful, but shortly after, he would come to know that his back pain was a blessing because he didn't share in the terrifying fate that awaited his friends. Here we see pictures of his friends saying goodbye to him, and Yuri was laughing, unaware that this would be the last goodbye. So the group became 9 people. The adventurers continued their journey through the Ural Mountains. Of course, when night came, they would set up their tent and sleep in it, continuing to push deeper into the mountains each day. After a few days, they reached a mountain that the locals called the Mountain of Death. There are other sources that say its name is the Mountain of Wind, or something like that, but most sources say its name is the Mountain of Death. Anyway, this is a satellite image of the mountain. As you can see, this is the mountain's peak, and this is the path the 9 adventurers took. This is the path at the base of the mountain, and at the foot of it, the 9 of them climbed up the mountain slope until they reached this point. At this point, night had fallen, so they decided to set up their tent on the slope. So they dug into the snow to create a flat surface to pitch their tent, as you can see in the picture. That night, the 9 adventurers slept in their tent without knowing it would be the last night of their lives. That night, disaster struck, turning their trip into one of the weirdest and most mysterious cases in modern history. The last entry found in one of their diaries said, "It's hard to imagine such comfort at the top of a mountain amidst the howling snowstorm, hundreds of kilometers away from any human civilization." She was feeling comfortable in their tent on top of the mountain amidst the snowstorm and harsh frost. She was feeling comfortable even though they were hundreds of kilometers away from any human civilization. What we can understand from this entry they found in her diary is that she wasn't feeling any fear, neither she nor her friends, about the disaster that was about to hit them that night. They had no idea. On the contrary, she said she felt comfortable. After that night, all contact with the 9 adventurers was completely lost. Their trip wasn't supposed to last more than 2 weeks at the most, but 3 weeks passed with no sign of them. That's when their families and friends started getting worried. So their families and friends gathered a team of volunteers to search for them. After several days of searching in the mountain areas, they finally found their tent. The tent had collapsed and was covered in a layer of snow, meaning the tent had stayed in that spot for weeks, which means a disaster must have struck the 9 adventurers, forcing them to leave their tent. The worst part was that the tent had been cut open from the inside with a knife. I mean, the tent had a door or an exit, but for some reason, the hikers were forced to cut through the tent with a knife from the inside to get out. This means they had to escape from something, either something inside the tent or something outside that blocked the exit, forcing them to go out the other way. The search team began inspecting around the tent and immediately noticed faint footprints in the snow. What's strange is that these footprints remained all this time, especially with the storms and constant snowfall. But scientifically, it seems that the fact the footprints were on the mountain slope, meaning they were slanted, reduced the snow covering them, so some prints remained. Another odd thing is that the footprints were organized, and the distances between them were short, indicating that the hikers' descent from the mountain after leaving the tent wasn't a run or a frantic escape. If someone is running or escaping, the distance between their footprints would be wider, and their movement would be uncoordinated. Especially since there were 9 of them, and their footprints continued together. If they were escaping, we would have seen the footprints scattered in all directions. These footprints continued descending the mountain for about 500 meters. To make the scene clearer in your mind, let's map this out. As we said, this is the mountain peak, and this is the point where the hikers set up their tent on the slope. The search team found footprints around the tent leading down this path on the mountain slope, meaning the hikers were descending the mountain. These footprints continued from the tent down the mountain for about 500 meters, then disappeared. The ground became flatter, so the snow buried the remaining prints. But even after the footprints disappeared, the search team kept walking in the same direction, and about 1,500 meters from the tent, they reached an area with trees, at the edge of the forest, at the base of the mountain. At these trees, they found the remains of a fire, and it was clear that the hikers tried to gather wood and light a fire to warm themselves. In this area among the trees, and close to the remains of the fire, they found the first 2 bodies of the 9 hikers. The bodies were covered in snow, and after removing the snow, it became clear that the bodies belonged to Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. The shocking part was that the 2 bodies were only wearing underwear and socks, no hats, no jackets, no shoes, not even pants, just underwear. There are clear pictures of the bodies, and the condition they were found in. But I can't show those pictures here because YouTube might cause us problems. If anyone wants to see the pictures, they can do a quick Google search and find them easily. The important thing is, we can say the state the bodies were found in was completely abnormal. Even if it were summer, they wouldn't be wearing so little clothing. So imagine if there was a snowstorm, and the temperature was -30 degrees, colder than your freezer, man. Obviously, we don't need to say that the cause of their death was hypothermia. They weren't just frozen. But in addition to their frozen bodies, there were also signs of bruises and wounds in different places. One of them had part of their nose missing, and another had the skin on their hand peeled off. It wasn't like their bodies were just frozen. They had bruises and wounds. And one of them, Krivonischenko, was found with a piece of his own hand in his mouth, which probably means he bit himself, making the situation even weirder. After finding these two bodies, they continued searching and found another body nearby. But this one was in a position that suggested the person had tried to go back to the tent, like they attempted to return. This body belonged to the leader, Igor Dyatlov, after whom the area and the case were named, now known as Dyatlov Pass. Dyatlov also died of hypothermia, and his body had signs of bruises and wounds. On top of that, there was frozen blood on his face. As for his clothes, he was dressed better than the two found under the trees, but it still wasn't enough for the freezing conditions they were in. And in this harsh weather, even with good clothes, you can't survive without fire or some kind of heat. That's probably why he tried to return to the tent, because the tent had the stove that provided warmth. For example, here's a picture of the tent when they set it up in another place before the mountain, and this is the stove chimney. That's the only explanation for why he might have tried to go back to the tent again. Next to Dyatlov's body, they also found two more bodies on the same path, heading back to the tent. The first body was one of the girls, and the second body was one of the young men. Both of their bodies also had signs of bruises and wounds, and the girl had several blows to her face. As we can see in this diagram, they found 5 bodies. First, the 2 under the trees, and then the 3 bodies along the mountain slope, belonging to those who tried to return to the tent. Someone might say that these 3 people died while going down, not while going up. The response to that is they found their bodies facing the direction of ascent. If they had died while going down, they would have found their bodies facing that direction. These 5 bodies weren't all found at once, especially the last 2. Of course, the authorities and specialized search teams came, and a large number of people participated in the search. But this is Siberia, and it's a mountainous area in the middle of winter. The snow doesn't stop, it's freezing cold, and visibility is tough, which made the search extremely difficult. It took weeks to find these 5 bodies. As for the remaining 4 bodies, it took 2 months to find them. Even though they weren't far from the location, they were found in a completely different direction. The remaining 4 bodies were found in this area, in the opposite direction of the tent. The reason it took so long to find them is that they were buried under 4 meters of snow. The search teams themselves couldn't even find them. It was actually a group of indigenous people who live in that mountainous area that found them. These indigenous people are called the Mansi tribes. It seems like they were the ones who discovered the site where the 4 bodies were buried. How did they find them, even though they were buried under 4 meters of snow? I don't know. Maybe because they know the land and the way it looks. When the snow started to thin, they might have noticed something off about the area, but only God knows. Anyway, it was members of the Mansi tribes who led the search teams to where the remaining 4 bodies were. The search teams came, dug at the site, and after digging through 4 meters of snow, they found what looked like a snow den. A pit dug into the snow with its floor covered in tree branches. Inside this den, they found pieces of clothing, some of them torn, including a pair of pants ripped in half. The teams dug more around this den and found the remaining 4 bodies. The bodies were all together, and underneath them was a stream running down the mountain. The bodies were piled up over this underground stream beneath the snow, and the water was still flowing. I don't know if that description is clear to you, but there's an actual picture of how the bodies were found. I hope the scene is clear in your mind. Here's an illustration showing how the bodies were found. As you can see, a deep hole in the snow with a stream underneath, and the bodies had fallen into this stream. In short, they found the 4 bodies piled up over an underground stream, and next to them was the den dug into the snow. It looks like they dug it themselves, maybe trying to shelter from the storm. And with the discovery of these 4 bodies, all 9 hikers had been found. The issue is that the condition of the last 4 bodies was way more violent than the others. One of the 3 young men had broken ribs, 6 on the left and 4 on the right, and he had severe injuries on the right side of his body. One of the older men, in his 30s, had a severe skull fracture on the right side of his head. The medical report mentioned that these injuries were fatal. The 4th young man, like the other 3, died of hypothermia. Even the 3 with fatal injuries were frozen, so we don't know if they died from the injuries or the freezing, or which happened first. The question is, how did they get these severe injuries? The investigation reports compared their injuries to those caused by bombs or violent car crashes. So what could have caused these strange injuries? The girl's eyes, tongue, and the area below her mouth were missing, like someone had ripped her eyes out, cut her tongue, and took them with them. The same thing happened to the man in his 30s with the broken ribs. His eyes were missing too. I think you can now understand why this case became one of the most famous ones. The sheer number of strange events and the condition of the 9 hikers' bodies take the mystery to a whole other level. Is it possible that someone or something caused their deaths? The Soviet investigators who took on the case considered the possibility that this was a crime and began investigating it as such, given the injuries found on the bodies. They started looking for anyone who could be a suspect in a crime like this. Siberia had camps and harsh prisons for criminals and political prisoners where they were forced to do hard labor in freezing temperatures and snow. There was a camp not too far from the mountain where the 9 hikers died. So the first theory the investigators considered was that some prisoners had escaped from this camp and ran into the hikers. The investigators reached out to the prison administration and asked if any prisoners had escaped recently. But the answer was no. No prisoners had escaped during that time. The second lead the investigators followed was Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the group, who had to turn back early in the trip due to back pain, leaving his friends behind. The investigators called him in and questioned him, treating him as a suspect. They considered the possibility that this was a setup, that he hated his friends and wanted to get rid of them. So he planned to do away with them on the mountain, far from anyone's sight. But Yuri explained that he left because of his back pain and that he returned home before the events on the mountain happened. Naturally, Yuri was nervous during the questioning. His friends had died, and he survived by sheer luck because he wasn't with them. Now the investigators were suspecting him and pressuring him. His nervousness made them more suspicious, and they even held him for a while to confirm his innocence. But later, they verified that Yuri had indeed returned to his hometown and was there during the time his friends were on the mountain, and several witnesses confirmed it. So Yuri was cleared as a suspect, but the investigators decided to use him to help with the investigation. They took him to the mountain to examine the site and had him identify his friends' bodies at the coroner's office, which must have been a shocking experience for him. He saw his friends in that condition, especially knowing he was supposed to be with them. But at least he provided the investigators with a useful observation. Some of his friends were wearing each other's clothes, which might explain why the first 2 bodies were found in their underwear. It's possible they were the first to die, and the others took their clothes to stay warm. The investigators continued their investigation, and the native Mansi tribes were among the suspects. You might be wondering, weren't the Mansi the ones who helped the search teams find the last 4 bodies? Yes, that's true. But that was one of the reasons the investigators were suspicious of them, especially since the bodies were buried under 4 meters of snow. Sure, the Mansi know the area well, but the question remains, how did they know the exact spot where the bodies were buried? In addition, the Mansi consider these mountain areas sacred, and no one is supposed to enter them without good reason. Also, one of their religious customs is that women are not allowed in their sacred lands, and there were 2 women in the group. The investigators interviewed some members of the Mansi tribe, but they all denied having anything to do with the deaths of the 9 hikers. During the questioning, some of the Mansi mentioned seeing a strange light in the sky on the night the hikers are believed to have died. They described it as an extremely bright light moving quickly. This is where one of the bizarre theories attempting to explain the case comes from: the alien theory. It's just one of the exaggerated theories surrounding the case, and there are plenty more. Back to the investigation. Most of the evidence collected by the search teams was sent to labs for testing. One of the strange surprises they found was that some of the hikers' clothing had traces of strong nuclear radiation. These weren't just small traces, it was actual radiation, almost as if they had been in a nuclear area. This should have been a new lead that pushed the investigators to dig deeper into the case. But the biggest shock came soon after, when it was announced that the case would be closed on May 28, 1959. The investigation had only lasted 3 months, and the Soviet authorities imposed a strict security zone around the mountain, preventing anyone from entering. This decision only fueled more exaggerated theories and conspiracy theories about the case. The final investigation report concluded that the case was unsolved, and the 9 hikers had encountered a natural force they couldn't overcome. That's the literal phrasing the investigators used in their report: a natural force they couldn't overcome. Since then, about 65 years have passed. Throughout these years, the case has only grown in fame, and endless theories and analyses have emerged. Interest in the case spiked even more with the rise of the internet, where the case's notoriety exploded and theories multiplied. Some exaggerated, some scientific, and some conspiratorial. We won't dive into the overly exaggerated theories like aliens, but we will take a look at some of the supernatural and conspiracy theories, as well as the scientific ones. We'll focus on the more logical theories, even if they aren't completely logical, in an attempt to get a clearer idea of what might have happened. Let's start with the conspiracy theories. One of them suggests that the Soviet government covered up the case to hide certain secrets. As we mentioned, the events took place in 1959, right in the middle of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. During this period, the Soviet Union was doing everything in its power to become the dominant world force. That was a time full of experiments and tests, especially in the military field, where the Soviet Union was trying to surpass the US. There were numerous secret sites where experiments were conducted, whether with weapons or chemicals, and some of these experiments may have been unethical or brutal. Conspiracy theories about secret experiments and certain weapons start from the discovery of radiation traces on the hikers' clothing. Why did their clothes have traces of nuclear radiation? Even during their funerals, many of their families and close ones noticed that their bodies had turned an orange color, and some parts of their bodies had burn marks. This could be a strong sign of radiation poisoning. So, what was the source of this radiation? Where did it come from? Some of the hikers' families were absolutely certain that the military and the government were involved in the case. There's something the military is covering up. Do you remember the light the Mansi tribesmen said they saw over the mountain? The conspiracy theory says that this light was a missile or weapon launched from a military base. and the missile failed to launch and crashed near the mountain, exploding. Maybe it had radioactive materials, and the explosion caused a wave of radiation to spread across the area, which shook the hikers' tents and scared them, making them leave the tents. But, if you remember, their footprints found outside the tents were orderly, meaning they didn't leave in a state of panic. Also, there's no other explanation for why they tore the tents from the inside to get out. And if the area was covered in radiation, why didn't they find traces of radiation in the location? Unless the government cleared the area and stopped anyone from checking for radiation there. In fact, the government did cordon off the area and banned anyone from entering for a long time. But was that really to prevent anyone from testing for radiation in the area? No one knows. It's worth mentioning that back then, nuclear energy was still new, and not many people were aware of the harmful effects that radiation could cause. What strengthens the conspiracy theory in this case is that one of the 9 hikers was suspected of being a spy or security officer. This person's name was Semyon Zolotaryov, and he was 37 years old. He wasn't originally part of the group, but the government added him at the last minute before the trip. This trip, as I told you before, was funded by the university they studied at, as if the university had placed a monitor on them. But in reality, it wasn't the university that placed the monitor. It was the government. There was suspicion that this man worked for intelligence or was an officer in the Soviet army. After investigating, it was revealed that he had participated in World War II. So why did the government put someone like him on the trip? Was his presence meant to stop them from reaching certain areas the government didn't want them to see? Even if the government wasn't directly responsible for the hikers' deaths, they might have had an interest in covering it up and preventing many parties from getting involved, as this could lead to the exposure of military secrets. Even Yuri Yudin, the 10th member of the group who survived because he returned at the beginning of the trip, believed the government had a hand in it, or at least was trying to cover up certain things. In 2013, before his death, Yuri revealed a deathbed secret. He said that when he was helping the investigators sort through the items found around the bodies and on the mountain, he noticed some things that didn't belong to any of them. He saw military gloves and strange-looking goggles, as well as extra skis. He was sure these things weren't with the group, so how did they get there? Yuri said on his deathbed that he was convinced the government arranged all of this to make everyone believe his friends' deaths were natural. But the real reason for their deaths was the secret experiments the military was conducting in the area. He didn't know if it was a deliberate experiment or an unintentional mistake. But this theory has aspects worth thinking about. Now, let's move on to the supernatural theory. The mountains in Russia and Asia are known to be home to some legends about strange creatures living there. One of these mythical creatures is called the Yeti. The Yeti is said to be a humanoid creature, walking on 2 legs, but covered in hair and resembling an ape or a gorilla. It's a huge creature said to possess enormous strength. The supernatural theory says that the hikers encountered the Yeti that night, and due to its attack on their tents, they were forced to flee. The Yeti theory started because of a photo found on one of the hikers' cameras. In this photo, a shadowy figure appears walking between the trees, resembling a human-like figure, and it seems to be watching the hikers from a distance. Some who analyzed the photo say this creature was 3 meters tall, and they believe this could be the first real photo of the Yeti. And that's what started this whole theory. The picture is real, but from my perspective, it's just the shadow of one of them. And somehow, because of the lighting or the angle of the shot, it came out looking like that. The theory that they were attacked by a Yeti might seem far-fetched, but this theory makes us think about other creatures, large animals we know exist and could be stronger than the mythical Yeti, like the brown bear, one of the most dangerous types of bears in the Russian mountains. Besides that, there are other wild animals like wolves and Siberian tigers that roam these mountain areas. So, Any of these animals might have surprised the hikers and made them flee the tent. But we go back to the same issue again, which is that the hikers' footprints show they weren't panicking when they left the tent. If an animal had attacked them, they would have run out in a panic. So this theory isn't fully convincing either. Let's move on to the next theory, which might be more logical, the stove theory. We talked about the stove they had inside the tent. Here's a picture of their tent when they were setting it up in another spot before the mountain. And as we can see here, this is the stove's chimney. They used this stove inside the tent for cooking and heating, and the stove was clearly handmade. They built it themselves. It wasn't one solid piece, but made of several parts they had to assemble so they could carry it with them. And it was clear that this stove had some issues sometimes. In one of the photos, one of the hikers is wearing a jacket that looks burnt, and the most likely reason is it got burnt by the stove. So we can conclude that the stove wasn't perfectly made, and there were serious risks using it, but they still relied on it. So what does the stove theory say? Did the stove catch fire, or did a fire break out in the tent? Of course not, because if that had happened, there would be burn marks on the tent. The stove theory says that due to an error in connecting the stovepipes or because the chimney got blocked, the smoke, instead of escaping through the chimney, came back into the tent. The tent quickly filled with smoke, and when they tried to put out the fire, the smoke just got worse and worse, creating chaos in that moment. It was hard for them to open the tent door because they couldn't see anything. So the fastest thing they could do was tear the tent from the inside and get out. This theory explains why they were calm and orderly in their movements after leaving the tent. There wasn't anything outside to panic about. The panic was inside the tent. I have one issue with this theory, though. Why didn't they return to the tent? Why did they go down the mountain? Maybe the answer is they thought it was safer to go down rather than stay in a tent with a big tear in it. But after going down, they realized things were worse. And that's why some of them later tried to go back to the tent. Maybe the last theory, which many believe to be the most logical, is the avalanche theory. The avalanche theory had been around since the beginning of the investigation, but there was no evidence of a large avalanche in the area, so it was dismissed early on. But later, some scientific analyses showed that the hikers dug out a flat spot on the mountain slope to set up their tent, which created a small snow wall on one side of the tent. This snow wall was small and wasn't supposed to pose any danger to them, but there's a phenomenon in winds that blow across mountains like these called katabatic winds, which are a type of wind that rushes down the mountain at high speeds carrying snow. It was an avalanche, but it wasn't a big one across the whole mountain. It was a small collapse of the snow wall that was on the side of the tent. So to get out of the tent, the hikers had to tear it from the inside. After getting out from under the snow, there's a big chance they were scared that a bigger avalanche could come down from the top of the mountain, so they decided to head down and leave the tent. This might explain why they left the tent with light or insufficient clothing, as the rest of their clothes were still inside the tent. Now, the question arises. With their experience, the hikers should have known that it was better to dig into the snow and go back to the tent to grab their stuff before heading down the mountain. But if they were scared of a bigger avalanche coming from above, their decision to head down and leave the tent would have made sense. Maybe after walking a short distance and realizing there was no big avalanche, they tried to go back to find the tent but couldn't because it was buried under snow, and the visibility was poor at that time. This is a logical analysis and scenario of what happened and explains why they left the tent with clothes that weren't enough for the weather they were in. Afterward, they stuck together until they reached the trees at the bottom of the mountain. By the trees, they tried to start a fire, and there were signs of some burned branches and fire marks. But clearly, these attempts weren't successful enough. The fire wasn't enough to warm them up, or maybe it even went out quickly. Even on some of the trees near the fire, there were marks showing that they might have tried to help each other gather drier branches to use for the fire. This could explain some of the cuts and bruises found on their bodies. After the failed attempts to light a fire near the trees, it seems like 2 of them died. The 2 who were later found in their underwear, it's likely that their friends, who were still alive, decided to take their clothes to use them. It's obviously a really sad thing to take the clothes of your friend who just froze to death in front of you, but it was a life or death situation. I mentioned that one of the 2 people who died first had a piece of flesh from his hand stuck inside his mouth. He was probably biting his hand as he was freezing, because when you freeze, you lose feeling in your limbs, so he might have been trying to bite or hit himself to feel something. But it seems like he was in his final moments. After that, it looks like the group split into 2. The reason for the split is unknown, maybe a difference in opinions. The important thing is that 3 of them decided to go back up the mountain to try to find the tent again, while 4 decided to go the other way to look for a way out. The 3 who went back to the top froze to death along the way, one by one, while the 4 others were found under 4 meters of snow. As we said before, the bodies of 3 of these 4 were in really bad shape. Their ribs were broken, their skulls were crushed, and their eyes and tongue were missing. So no doubt something violent happened to them, and that needs a different theory to explain it. There's a theory that fits the place where they were found. It seems like the 4 of them tried to dig a den in the snow and brought some branches from the trees to support the den or to cover the ground with them. Sure, hiding in the snow wouldn't have done much to reduce the cold, but at least under the snow, the strong winds wouldn't hit them, and they would try to warm each other with their body heat, so maybe their chances of survival would have been higher. However, it seems like the spot they chose to dig their den was over a water stream, and the snow in that area wasn't thick enough to hold its own weight. There was a stream flowing underneath. While they were digging, the snow beneath them collapsed, and they fell into the underground water stream, with large amounts of snow falling on top of them. This fall, and the weight of the snow crushing them from above, is the only explanation for the severe injuries and fractures they suffered. Their bodies fell into the stream, where they were found buried under the snow. This water stream, where their bodies stayed, might explain why 2 of them were missing their eyes, and 1 was missing her tongue and part of her mouth. Their bodies remained in the water stream for 2 months until they were found. 2 months is long enough for decomposition to begin. Yes, the weather was freezing, which slowed the process, but it's normal for the inside of the bodies to start decomposing. The faces of the 2 without eyes and the 1 without a tongue were in the stream, with their faces in running water. So, with slow decomposition and the flowing water running over their faces, it's likely that the eyes decomposed and were carried away by the water, and the tongue and part of the mouth disappeared in the same way due to decomposition and being washed away by the water. The last thing we haven't found an explanation for is the clothes that were found to have traces of nuclear radiation. These pieces of clothing actually belonged to only 2 people in the group, Alexander Kolevatov and Lyudmila Dubinina. And it turns out the explanation for that is simpler than you might think. Both of these people had recently graduated from university and worked at nuclear facilities, and one of them might have been involved in cleaning up the aftermath of the Kyshtym nuclear disaster. The Kyshtym disaster was similar to Chernobyl, but it happened much earlier, specifically in 1957, and it's considered the 3rd largest nuclear disaster. Since these 2 worked in nuclear facilities, and one of them participated in cleaning up one of the biggest nuclear disasters, it's not surprising that their clothes had traces of nuclear radiation. I think with that, I've covered all the logical explanations and theories that have been put forward about the events that happened. There's one last theory called the combined theory. This theory, as the name suggests, combines the other theories. It might say that what happened was the result of several theories overlapping at the same time. Maybe there was a missile explosion from a failed military experiment, and that explosion caused an avalanche. Maybe when the hikers came down from the mountain, they were attacked by a bear or some animal near the trees, and they ran from it. In summary, the combined theory suggests that there's no definitive explanation for what happened. No matter how accurate or strong the analyses are, they're still just theories. There's no way to know what exactly happened that night, which is what makes this case one of the most famous and mysterious in history. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button. And for those who haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll get notified when I upload new videos. See you in the next video. Peace out.